Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our CAFMS and Southern Fire Exchange webinar today. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. I'm here today with our team, Christian Fernandez and Sarah Kane with the Southern Fire Exchange from NC State University and Tall Timbers. And
hi, everybody, and welcome. We're super excited for today's webinar. My name is Lindsay Hosier, and I am the coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. For short, we go by CAFMS. Adam Coates is our principal investigator, and he is the associate professor of wildland fire ecology and management at Virginia Tech. I am physically located in Lexington, Virginia. However, CAFMS does cover the Appalachian region, and it ranges from Alabama and Georgia all the way up to parts of Pennsylvania and New York. And our main goal at CAFMS is we want to disseminate products and host activities that will increase and accelerate the flow of fire science and management between fire scientists and managers. And I'll pass it back to you, David.
awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. It's great to be with everybody today. Today, we're excited to feature a presentation by Dr. Charles Lafon, Professor of Geography at Texas A&M University. Dr. Lafon will be sharing a presentation on his work to understand the history of fire in the Southern Blue Ridge and Piedmont regions. So without further ado, our presenter today is Dr. Charles Lafon. Dr. Lafon is a professor of geography at Texas A&M University. He's a native of the Appalachian Mountains of Southwest Virginia, and he earned his BA from Emory and Henry College in Virginia, and his MS and PhD from the University of Tennessee. His research emphasizes spatial patterns and historical changes in vegetation and disturbance regimes. So with that, welcome, Charles. We're thankful to have you here with us. I know we're all looking forward to your presentation. And everybody, we're glad you're here. And one moment as we trade out these slides.
Okay, thanks, David, for that introduction. I'm happy to be here and present. Back in May of this year, I attended the annual workshop of the Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network that was held in Rabun County, Georgia, in the northeastern part of Georgia, along the Blue Ridge escarpment. And the date of the first day of the workshop happened to coincide with the 250th anniversary of William Bartram traveling through the upper Piedmont of South Carolina and into the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia and North Carolina. And so for my presentation that day, I used some of William Bartram's. William Bartram, if you don't know, was a naturalist. He recorded many observations of landscapes and vegetation. So I used some of his historical accounts and other historical records like witness trees of Rabun County and the vicinity to reconstruct a history of vegetation and fire-adapted vegetation on that landscape for the past 250 years. The next day in the field, I ended up on a field trip with in the same van as Lindsay Hosier of CAFMS and Christian Fernandez of SFE. And while we were on the van together, Christian, I think it was, suggested that we might want to expand the talk I had just given into a webinar for a larger audience, for a broader region, and perhaps looking at more different types of data sources about fire history in the region. And so after further conversations with David Godwin, we decided to focus on the entire Blue Ridge, both the northern and the southern Blue Ridge. As most of you probably recognize, the northern Blue Ridge is a narrow ridge or series of ridges that towers, 2,000 or 3,000 feet, or in some places more, above the surrounding lowlands of the Piedmont to the east and the Great Valley of the Appalachians to the west. And it is separated from the southern Blue Ridge by a gap there, the Roanoke Gap, where the Roanoke River cuts through. The southern Blue Ridge is a broader highland region with mountains and valleys. Some of it has more of a plateau appearance. It has an eastern escarpment that is a tremendous topographic step above the Piedmont to the east. And so the talk today will focus primarily on that, what we might call the Blue Ridge proper, the eastern escarpment of the southern Blue Ridge, and all the way up through the northern Blue Ridge. But we will think about the vicinity of the Blue Ridge as well, including the western Piedmont and other parts of the southern Blue Ridge. One reason for doing that is that the records the records that we're looking at are taken from various places, not just the Blue Ridge, but also because excuse me, what starts on the Blue Ridge doesn't necessarily stay on the Blue Ridge, and especially with regard to things like weather and fire, things that can spread. For example, the Blue Ridge as an area of high topographic relief and rugged terrain generates convection, and that can result in thunderstorms and lightning. In fact, parts of the Blue Ridge are a lightning ignition hotspot. And it's reasonable to believe that as those thunderstorms in the past drifted out over the Piedmont, that they would have ignited fires across the Piedmont as well, back before it was fragmented by farms and roads and things like that. So the Blue Ridge and the Piedmont are linked in some ways climatically, as well as culturally. The Blue Ridge has been a major influence on human societies, including the early European colonization of the eastern United States. This is a map from Donald Meinig's book on the historical geography of the U.S. And what it shows is the English settlement originating around the Tidewater regions, moving in across the Piedmont. It was able to penetrate some of those gaps in the Blue Ridge, but by and large, the settlement west of the Blue Ridge and the Great Valley came from a completely different ethnic stock. It was mainly the Scotch Irish and Germans and others like the Swedes and so forth from up in the Delaware, who originated in the Delaware River Valley in southeastern Pennsylvania. And moved westward and then southwestward through the Great Valley into the Appalachians. And so what you'll also note there is that at the Roanoke Gap between the northern and southern Blue Ridge, there was an outlet for that settlement pattern. And so many of the Scotch Irish also spilled out onto the southern Piedmont. And so the southern Piedmont of Virginia and then southward into the Carolinas and Georgia also has a pretty large Scotch-Irish component as a consequence of that. Both the English and the Scotch-Irish brought with them a cultural history of burning that reached back to the Old World. The Scotch-Irish, in fact, had also interfaced with the Finns and the Swedes, who brought a history of burning from the Old World as well there in the lower Delaware River Valley. So we have a region that is that has a cultural history of burning in terms of the European settlers, but also the Native Americans who were there before. And, when we think about the fire history of this region, we recognize that there are many wildlife and plant species that thrive in areas that are burned frequently or even depend on frequently burned areas. And the presence of those plant and animal species in the communities they inhabit really does imply that there's been a long history of fire on these landscapes. What we know quite well about fire history in the Blue Ridge and environs is that is the fire history of the past century or a little more. We know that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was widespread logging across the region. That logging episode was associated with wildfires that were in many cases quite destructive. And in the aftermath of those destructive wildfires, fire suppression and fire protection prevention really became effective in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century. And now we've had decades, nearly a century of increased forest density, changing forest composition from oak and pine and chestnut to things like red maple and black gum and white pine. And this overall term that's used for this shift in density of forest and species compositional change and the increased shade of the forest floor is called mesovegetation, because the forest is becoming increasingly moist and filled with mesophytic species. We'd like to put this century or so of recent fire history and lack of fire into a longer historical context. And there's been a lot of research in the last couple of decades in particular about fire history across Eastern North America. And I think it's fair to say that we've kind of developed a what we might call a standard model of how fire and vegetation behaved on the landscapes of the Eastern United States, not just the Appalachian region, the whole Eastern United States, Northeastern, Southeastern United States, over the past few centuries. And we think that that the vegetation was maintained by frequent fires of low severity set by Native Americans and then the white settlers like the Scotch Irish and English, and also by lightning. It also appears pretty conclusively that there was dominance over most of the landscape at least, by what we might call pyrophilic species. These would be tree species that benefit from fire, like oaks and pines, that can at least resist fire because of features like thick bark, as opposed to pyrophobic species that are more sensitive to fire, like maples, for example. Primarily oak in the interior and pine on the coastal plain. There seems to have been in many places a single overstory layer over an understory of grasses rather than a thick multi-layered forest. Many cases of woodland as opposed to a continuous forest cover with lots of light penetrating the canopy and reaching the floor, where there was grassland, grasses in the understory of the woodlands, or even grassy openings, glades, or up to prairies of various sizes scattered throughout the region. All this was, of course, disrupted by the commercial logging and associated wildfires of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and then by the fire suppression that we've seen since then that has led to mesovegetation. So the questions for my talk today follow from what I've just mentioned. One is how common was fire and fire-adapted or fire-dependent or pyrophilic vegetation on landscapes of the Blue Ridge and vicinity before the logging episode of the late 19th and early 20th century? And then do patterns of the Blue Ridge correspond, and patterns of fire and vegetation on the Blue Ridge correspond to the general model of fire history across the broader eastern U.S.? This is a reasonable question to ask because the Blue Ridge, the Appalachians in general, are more rugged and therefore probably have more barriers to the spread of fire, which would influence fire frequency than other parts of the eastern U.S. It's also wetter and cooler than many other parts of the eastern U.S. And so fire behavior might be different. Fire history might be different. And so what I'm going to do today is look at some records of fire and vegetation history from the Blue Ridge and the Western Piedmont, as well as that'll be the main part of my talk, and then I'm going to wrap it up with some comments on what I'm calling fire on Blue Ridge landscapes, how fire is embedded in landscapes. You'll see what I mean when we get there. With regard to the records of fire and vegetation history, there are two different types of records I want to cover. One are historical records. One is historical records. The other is paleoecological records. And I'm not going to give an exhaustive accounting of all the examples that are available, but this will be a selection of different examples of these different types of historical and paleoecological records. The first type of historical record I wanted to mention are narrative accounts and even old maps of fire or vegetation that was shaped by fire before European settlement. Really, the earliest is De Soto's route, De Soto's expedition in 1539 through 41 across the southeast, and he did travel through the Piedmont of South Carolina, North Carolina, and the Blue Ridge of Georgia, or at least of North Carolina and Tennessee. The exact route is not known precisely. But back in 1957, Erhard Rosland assembled a lot of different records of grasslands across the southeastern United States, and he looked at De Soto's, the reports from De Soto's expedition. And here are his summaries of De Soto's expedition across the Piedmont area of South Carolina and into the Blue Ridge of North Carolina and Tennessee. I would just highlight a couple of statements here that in this region, there were 3 or 4 plains mentioned along the route using both the term savanna and llano. So it does suggest there were open, grassy landscapes, fairly flat terrain. The Piedmont was easy to traverse, either afoot or on horseback, and there was plenty of grass for the livestock, which could indicate it was fire-maintained grasslands. They passed in the Piedmont many fine fields of tilled land, so obviously some cultivated landscapes there, unsurprisingly. And in the mountains, they saw a great quantity of oaks and extensive grazing lands. This is a kind of vegetation that in a wet climate like the southern Blue Ridge Mountains would not exist without being maintained by fire and probably by grazing by elk as well. A little over a century later, John Lederer traveled through parts of Virginia and North Carolina around 1670, excuse me. And here's a summary of some of the comments he made. He called the Piedmont the Highlands. One comment was, the ground is overgrown with underwood in many places, and that so perplexed and interwoven with vines that who travels here must sometimes cut through his way. And so clearly it wasn't all open, fire-maintained savanna. However, when he got down to describing places that were in the vicinity of Native American villages, he said the parts inhabited here are pleasant and fruitful because cleared of wood and laid open to the sun. The valleys feed numerous herds of deer and elks larger than oxen. These valleys they call savannae, being marsh grounds at the foot of the Appalachians. So some parts of the Piedmont then were clearly open grasslands. This is a section where he describes what I think is the Western Blue Ridge, the Western Piedmont adjacent to the Blue Ridge. I think it was in the vicinity of the Shenandoah National Park, but I might be wrong in terms of exactly nailing down what he had in mind. But we traveled through the savanna amongst the vast herds of red and fallow deer, which would be undoubtedly elk and white-tailed deer, which stood gazing at us. And a little after we came to the promontories or spurs of the Appalachian Mountains. These savanna are low grounds at the foot of the Appalachians. And further down, the flowery meads or meadows whose luxurious herbage invites numerous herds of red deer or elk. So clearly he was seeing pretty extensive grasslands there on the Western Piedmont adjacent to the Appalachian Mountains. This is a map that he provided. East is oriented down, as was common back then. The mountains there on the top of the map, that's the Blue Ridge. I've underlined here savanna. He labels savanna. That's that grassland area that he encountered along the western edge of the Piedmont at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So evidence of grasslands. Let's look at a few of William Bartram's comments. There's a lot of William Bartram quotes I could include here. I'll just look at a few focused on the area around northeast Georgia, right around Rabun County, northwest South Carolina, and and southwestern North Carolina. And the arrow points down to the part of his trek that is included here. That red line is where we think the best reconstruction of where his route was through that vicinity. So he saw grand forest, dark detached groves, vales, and meadows. So there seems to have been a mosaic of open grassy areas and more densely forested areas as well. He talks about the meadows affording exuberant pasturage for cattle. He climbed what apparently was Satula Mountain along the Blue Ridge Escarpment in North Carolina. He mentioned turfy ridges. Turfy would mean grassy ridges, varied with groves of stately forest trees. So again, a mix of forested and grassy areas. He climbed steep grassy hillsides. So I'm pointing out some of the vegetation that would have been molded by fire, but he also, I should point out, as he descended the mountain, he followed a trail along a creek, and there he noted much more dense vegetation, what we might with mesophytic species. So a mesophytic cove forest would have been more what he would have witnessed there. So it wasn't all just fire maintained vegetation. There were patches of mesophytic forest along the streams as well. When he got over into the Little Tennessee River Valley, he mentioned meadows, extensive meadows, the opening of the extensive and fruitful vale of Cowie, which is the Little Tennessee River Valley. So extensive grasslands there. Here's another historic record from the same area. This guy, Andrew Ritchie, was a descendant of the earliest settlers in the Little Tennessee River Valley of Rabun County, Georgia. He wrote the history of Rabun County back in 1948, and he said, "I used to hear from old people in my childhood that when the first white people came, the Indians had kept the woods burned out so regularly that the trees were scattering and that the woods were so open that a wagon could be driven through." So there we have one quote directly linking frequent burning and open vegetation in a way that really that Bartram didn't actually. Here's another from that general vicinity. Andrew Ellicott, as he was surveying the North Carolina-Georgia border, here he was in South Carolina, right near where the three states converge. "The greatest inconvenience we experienced arose from the smoke occasioned by the annual custom of the Indians in burning the woods. These fires, scattered over a vast extent of country, made a beautiful and brilliant appearance at night, particularly when ascending the sides of the mountains." So we have here a record of frequent burning and vast extensive burning, not limited in extent, but covering much of the landscape. Now, part of that general model of fire in the eastern United States is that the white settlers then, as they colonized, continued to burn frequently. And so let's look at a couple of accounts of that sort of thing. Here again with Andrew Ritchie and his history of Rabun County. Most of the people burned off their timbered lands in the late fall and early spring. They followed the habit of the Indians. So here again, we have a record of that. Back in 1900 and 1901, Ayers and Ash surveyed the entire Blue Ridge, southern Blue Ridge, that is, from Virginia down through North Carolina and Tennessee, southward all the way into South Carolina and Georgia. They surveyed every creek drainage basin in the region and described the forest composition and volume and so forth. And so they noted this, that light fires crept through the woods year after year. They found evidence of such fire over approximately 4.5 million acres, or over 80% of the entire area. So here we have a record of frequent burning over most of the landscape of the southern Blue Ridge. Actually, I don't need historical written records. I have my own dad who grew up in Southwest Virginia. This is the Ridge and Valley, not the Blue Ridge, but it's the same culture. He grew up in the 1930s and 40s, and he remembers people burning their fields every fall, burning the broom sage, and broom sage would come back even more dense than it was before. So, we have an oral history in my family of people burning the vegetation in the past on a regular basis. And my dad caught really the ending of that by the mid-20th century. That was fading out. Let's look at another type of historical record, witness trees from historical land surveys. As many of you are familiar, at the corners of land surveys, surveyors mark witness trees and record the species and sometimes the diameter of the trees. So back in, some of you are aware of this report that we published back in 2017. It was sponsored by by CAFMS actually, and published by the Southern Research Station as a general technical report. And we looked at different types of evidence of fire history in the Appalachian Mountains, including the Piedmont. And for one chapter, we looked at witness tree records, and that map on the right shows the areas that had been conducted, in which a witness tree study had been conducted. And so I'm not going to go through those in any detail, but I'll just summarize it the way we did in the general technical report. On the x-axis here is just different studies. They're arranged by physiographic province. Appalachian Plateau, the light blue bars on the left, the dark blue ones in the middle, Ridge and Valley, the medium blue on the right, Piedmont. We didn't have any sites from the Blue Ridge, unfortunately. But on the y-axis is the percent species composition, in this case by oaks. And oaks were common across the region, but especially in the Piedmont and the Ridge and Valley. Looking at pines, pines were most common in the Piedmont, to some extent the Ridge and Valley, not so much on the Appalachian Plateau. And then the other species, we just mixed everything together here, which could include xerophytic and mesophytic species that are not oak or pine. And not surprisingly, they were most common on the Appalachian Plateau, which is, the site of the kind of where the mixed mesophytic forest is centered. So no surprise that mesophytic species were more common over there. But because there were no Blue Ridge sites, that inspired one of my graduate students, Taylor Siskind, a few years ago, to conduct a witness tree study of Rabun County, Georgia. One advantage of Georgia for witness trees that, unlike all the other states of the central and southern Appalachian Mountains, at least the original 13, those that were part of the original 13 colonies, is that it used a regular grid for the survey instead of a meets and bounds irregular network. And because there's a regular grid established over the landscape in Georgia, you have a more reliable representation of what the initial vegetation was. And so Taylor took this old survey from Rabun County, Georgia, and digitized the trees into all those corners into GIS. And on this map, those tree species, those corners, are classified into general categories. The light brown dots represent corners that were occupied by a pyrophilic species, like an oak or hickory or chestnut or pine or something like that. The dark greens are pyrophobic mesophytic, the ones that could not withstand fire as much, so like maples or yellow poplar. Excuse me. And then the light green ones are treeless corners. A lot of the corners didn't have a tree at all. They just had to put a stake in the ground because there was no tree available as a witness tree, apparently. When we look at the more detailed generic level composition of those points, pyrophilic trees covered 71% of all the corners, and pyrophobic trees covered 6% of the corners, and treeless corners, excuse me, which might represent open areas, grasslands, cane breaks, old Cherokee abandoned fields. It could be a variety of things, but there does seem to imply some openness of the landscape there, occupied about a quarter of all the corners. If we just ignore the treeless corners for now and focus on the pyrophilic versus the pyrophilic trees were clearly dominant, 92% versus 8% of all the corners with trees. I would note that some of the pines in the survey may have actually been hemlock, because hemlock was not recognized by taxonomists as a genus in the early 1820s. It was actually in the 1820s. It was actually hemlocks were part of the pine genus at that point. One thing to notice is that oaks dominated. Half of all the corners with trees were occupied by oak. This really wasn't an oak chestnut forest. It was an mixed oak forest with a mixture also of oak, of chestnut, of hickory, of pine, and so forth. And this agrees with a recent meta-analysis by Hanbury and Nowacki of Eastern U.S. witness tree studies from across the whole region, which showed that most of the interior of the region was dominated by oak. They call it oak as a foundational genus. They didn't find much evidence for oak chestnut forest. Okay, remember that survey by Ayers and Ash from 1900 to 1901, looking at just the part of it that focused on right around Rabun County. This is 1900, 1901. That's 80 years after settlement, after the survey of 1820. So after 8 decades of primarily Scotch-Irish settlement, people with the cultural history of burning, here's what the forest composition looked like. Oak was about half the species. just like it was in 1820. Chestnut was common. It wasn't an oak chestnut forest. It was a mixed oak forest with a lot of chestnut, hickory, pine, and so forth. So the composition remained fairly similar across that time period. One thing that Ayers and Ash did was, after surveying the landscape, they classified the landscape, mapping the forest volume across the landscape. The reds are cleared areas in the valleys, but with regard to the forested areas, the wooded areas, most of it was very lightly forested. The average timber volume across that Rabun County area was 1,590 board feet per acre, which is not really a dense forest. That's more like a woodland. By comparison, today, after nearly a century of fire suppression and mesofication, the volume is over 13,000 board feet per acre. So this was a landscape with a woodland, really, more than forest cover, probably maintained by frequent burning and by grazing as well. Now, another type of historical record is old photos and paintings. From the National Archives, I've got quite a few old photos of vegetation in the southeastern United States. Jim Goulden, retired U.S. Forest Service, gave me a bunch of those, but most of those are from the early 20th century or even up to the mid 20th century, and they don't really capture the time span that I'm most interested in. However, the Tallulah Gorge there in North Georgia is a scenic site within traveling distance of like Atlanta and places, population. So there's been a lot of attention to it for quite a long time. In fact, we have a painting from 1841. This is a pretty well-known painting by George Cook, only 20 years after it was originally surveyed. And George Cook, I'm going to zoom in on the top section of his painting there. You'll see that little section of dead trees in a bare patch. That looks just like a pine stand that's been burned by a crown fire. And I think that's a good chance that that's what it was. I did find an old, again, because this is a scenic site, I found an old photo from the late 19th century. And I'm going to zoom in on a couple of parts of it right there. You can see a pretty open slope. This is the kind of vegetation you'd expect to see after frequent burning. There's not dense forest on it. It's woodland with probably grassy ground cover. I'm also going to go across the gorge to the other side and zoom in on this section. And right here, it's not real clear because it's a wintertime photo, but this is a section of burned pine stand. I'm pretty sure this is a burned pine forest that had been burned in a crown fire, similar to what George Cook had portrayed in his painting. Right down in there, you probably can't see it too well on screen, but our publication that we just published in Physical Geography, if you download it, you can find it there. There's a lot of dead pine snags in there. This is the type of thing you see after a severe crown fire has occurred in a pine stand. And these still occur on when Nathan Klaus of the Georgia DNR tells me that when they do prescribed burning in the Tallulah Gorge today, they still get this kind of fire behavior. This is a very natural part of the fire regime in that landscape of the Tallulah Gorge. Okay, so that's a scattering of some different types of historical documentation that gives us some glimpses of past fire and fire-maintained vegetation. Excuse me. Let's look at the paleoecological records. I want to look at two types. One is fire-scarred trees. Fires can scar trees at the base. This on the left side is a pine that's been scarred by multiple fires. That's on the George Washington National Forest in Virginia, that particular tree. And we can go and cut sections out of those fire-scarred trees. They're just injured. They were not killed by the fire. We can cut a section out of it, bring it back to the lab, sand it down, date the tree rings. And once each ring is assigned to a year, then we can assign years to the fire scars that are embedded in those tree rings. And the results that we obtain look like this. This is a fire chart, as we call it. This one's from Kelly Mountain on the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. This is in the Blue Ridge, a little south of Shenandoah National Park, just east of the Shenandoah Valley, Augusta County, Virginia. This is one of the dissertation sites of my former PhD student, Serena Aldrich. And what we have here on the x-axis at the bottom, that's a timeline that's represented by this, that we represent here. All of those horizontal lines that are stacked on top of each other, those are different trees. And the length of the line represents the years that it covers relative to that timeline at the bottom. The little vertical hatch marks on there are dated fire scars. And at the bottom, we carry all those dated fire scars down and make a composite record along that timeline. And what we find is that fires burned on average every 4 years. This is a frequent fire regime. The first scar was back in 1638, so fires have been burning for a long time. You know, we have pre-European settlement fire history here all the way up through the 20th century. One thing to note here too is that the last fire was in 1921. We have the fire exclusion interval here. No fires. This is a site now that has been without fire for about a century after it used to burn at a 4-year interval on average. Let's move south to Linville Mountain, just outside the Linville Gorge on the Blue Ridge Escarpment in North Carolina. This is one of the dissertation sites of my former PhD student, Will Flatley. And a similar fire chart, 4-year return interval. This one doesn't go quite as far back in time, but it also has that fire exclusion era pattern of very little burning. Moving north, this is a recent fire history study from the very northern edge of the Blue Ridge, Catoctin Mountain, Maryland, by Lauren Howard et al. Not a huge sample size here, but we see a similar pattern, 5-year return interval and then a period of fire exclusion. And then going south to really beyond the Blue Ridge, but to the Talladega Mountains that are an outlier really of the Blue Ridge, a couple of sites down there sampled by Adam Bale at University of Missouri for his master's thesis. This is one of those sites, Chocoloco Mountain in the Talladega National Forest, a very frequent fire regime there, 3-year fire return interval. Maybe there's some a reduction in fire frequency in the 20th century, but there still has been quite a bit of burning even up to the present. Let's look over at the Western Piedmont. There hasn't been much fire history study of this type in the Piedmont, but one was published by Dane Kuppinger a few years ago from Pilot Mountain, North Carolina. 2-year fire return interval. Maybe there's a fire exclusion era there. They're really the fires that what Dane Kuppinger did note is that the fires that were recorded since the mid 20th century have not been very wide in extent. They didn't cover most of the mountain like they had in the past. So there has been an effect of fire exclusion on that landscape, even though it doesn't quite appear to be the case there. It is an effect in the extent, if not the frequency of the whole landscape. And then in the Western Great Smoky Mountains National Park, we have a whole network of fire history sites over there. I'll just look at one of those, Lick Log, that southernmost one, was also from Will Flatley's dissertation, divided up into multiple tree stands there. A whole lot of fire-scarred trees at that site, 2-year fire return interval, and a period of fire exclusion since the park was established. So these graphs on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is an index just of fire history. They're a way of summing up the fire charts that we were just looking at. And so this is from Serena Aldridge's dissertation, George Washington National Forest. The top 2 are from the Ridge and Valley, so we won't pay attention to them since our focus is on the Blue Ridge. That Kelly Mountain one there on the bottom, what we're looking at here, fire was burning frequently back from before European settlement all the way up to the early 20th century, and then it plummeted. So we have across these different sites, and we've looked at different sites across the Blue Ridge and Western Piedmont, different lengths of time in the fire chronology, different numbers of fire-scarred trees, but a very similar story across the whole region. Here's from the Southern Appalachians Blue Ridge sites here, Lick Log and Linville Mountain from Will Flatley's dissertation, a similar pattern, frequent burning up until the early to mid 20th century, and then a decline in fire frequency. Tree rings can also tell us other things besides just how frequently fires occur. That's Will Flatley on the right, and one of our undergrad students, Stephen Tarpley, on the left. They're coring a tree, using the tree cores to age the trees. When did the trees establish? This is that Lick Log watershed where the fire history study was conducted that we were just looking at. The little triangles represent fire scar sites, fire scar trees. The squares represent plots that we set up within the forest across a topographic moisture gradient from the cove forest down to the bottom all the way up to the oak and into the pine stands on the ridges. And we cored the trees within those plots. And I'm going to look at just one type of those, the chestnut oak dominated stands on the side slopes of those ridges. And what we're looking at here are establishment dates by decade. The decade is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the number of trees recruited in each decade out there on the landscape today. The last major fire occurred in 1916. Before that, fires were occurring at about a 2-year return interval on this landscape. And when we look at the trees that are out there today, there are a lot of old oaks that were established. The orange bars represent oaks. A lot of old oaks, mostly chestnut oak, that were established throughout the 1600s, 1700s, up the 1800s at intervals. Not a whole lot. They're kind of scattered across the landscape. There were a few pines. The greens were pines, but these are oak stands. These are not the pine stands here. And then the other would represent anything from hemlock to hickory, really, anything that's not an oak or a pine. So what happened after 1916? Everything changed immediately. The forest composition started to change as other species invaded, and now today, I mean, you see Fraser magnolia, you see hemlock, you see hickory, you see all kinds of stuff, as well as a lot of oak too and pine up on those landscapes. So the forest changed dramatically as soon as the frequent fire stopped. So we had frequent burning with oak regeneration periodically, and today we have dense forests with a lot of mesophytic species coming in. Now, so fire-scarred trees and tree rings can only take us back so far because of the lifespan of trees and decay. Can we reach back beyond that? Yes, we can in some ways with not as much resolution temporally, but we can use charcoal records to date fire occurrences back further in the past. And charcoal is a consequence, it's a remnant of, it's a leftover relic of fires burning on the landscape. And so fires, charcoal can be obtained from sediment cores. That's my PhD advisor, Sally Horn, there in the center of the photo. Removing a sediment core from a bog, that bog can be collected from the bog or the lake and taken back to the lab, and the sediment and the pollen and the charcoal that's entombed in that sediment core can be removed and analyzed and counted, such that we end up with a record of fire and vegetation, the different types of pollen from different species over time. This is the kind of chart that is produced from that kind of study. This is from Paul and Hazel Delcourt, 3 sites across the Appalachian region. On the left side here, we have a time axis with older at the bottom and younger at the top. We're going to look at the Horse Cove Bog site over on the right. That's in North Carolina, right on the Blue Ridge Escarpment. And what you're seeing there is oak and chestnut pollen over time. There's radiocarbon control on the dating of this core. And so the dating of this, we have dating to indicate how the vegetation changed over time, as well as how the charcoal, that is fire occurrence, changed over time. Now, remember that GTR that we did back in 2017. For that, we decided to translate those pollen and charcoal graphs into something a little more digestible. And so we put them on a graph like this. On the y-axis is time, 0 on the right is present, and then dating back further in time to the left, and then charcoal and pollen abundance on the y-axis. The dark bars are charcoal abundance, and so you can see over the 4,000-year history of Horse Cove Bog that's recorded there, fire has been present on the landscape. The different color lines represent different species, or at least genera of trees, and those the oak in particular has been abundant on the landscape in association with frequent burning in the last 4,000 years. Note that Horse Cove Bog is near that Rabun County, Georgia site, so it kind of puts William Bartram and the witness tree records into some kind of a context. Let's move north to Spring Pond, Virginia. This is in the same vicinity on the Blue Ridge as that Kelly Mountain fire scar site we looked at. This one had a very low sediment accumulation rate because of its geomorphic setting. So it's low resolution, but we do have many thousands of years of record here of charcoal, those dark bars, and tree pollen, especially oak, on that landscape. So it's a landscape in which fire and oak have been present throughout the Holocene, really. One problem with the Appalachians is that there are not a lot of bogs or ponds on the Appalachian landscapes, and so there's another way of finding evidence for past burning from charcoal, and that is the core soil. And from in the soil cores, just from the landscape, can be obtained some charcoal fragments. And if they're radiocarbon dated, you can piece together a fire history for a site. One of Sally Horn's students, Chris Underwood, for his dissertation, looked at 3 sites in the western Great Smoky Mountains that correspond with our fire scar sites over there. We're going to just look at one of those to represent all of them. And on the y-axis, on the x-axis again, this is from that GTR, how we summarized it, time on the x-axis, and then charcoal fragments on the y-axis. And so you can see that there's a history through the last 10,000 years, the Holocene, of fire on that landscape. Excuse me, not enough is known about charcoal abundance in the landscape or in a soil core to know whether the differences in height of the bars really means anything with regard to fire frequency changes over time. But the message here is that fire has been a part of this landscape for a long time. Sally has some other studies going in the eastern Great Smoky Mountains where it's wetter, but she doesn't have the results for those available yet. So when we look at these various types of historical and paleoecological data and compare them to this general model of fire behavior across the U.S. and across the eastern U.S. and how that applies to the Blue Ridge and vicinity, yes, I think we have good evidence that there was frequent fire of low severity set by Native Americans and then by white settlers and probably also by lightning. There was dominance by pyrophilic species, especially by oak. There's many different types of evidence of, open woodlands or grasslands of various sizes. And of course, this was all disrupted by commercial logging and mesofication. Okay, so I wanted to in the last few minutes here, close up with some ideas or thoughts about fire on Blue Ridge landscapes. The first point, and I've got 4 points I want to make. The first is that landscapes are not uniformly flammable. I focused on the flammable parts of the landscape, the evidence about fire frequency and fire maintained vegetation, but there are large areas, especially in the southern Blue Ridge, with the high ranges like the Smokies and the Black Mountains and Mount Rogers and White Top, with high mountains with spruce and fir and northern hardwoods, and those are just too wet and cool to burn on a regular basis. And so the fire history that I've been discussing doesn't apply to those high elevation sites. And even on landscapes like this one, this is around the James River Gorge in Virginia, low to moderate elevations in which pine and oak dominate almost the whole landscape. Even on a landscape like that, there are fire sheltered spots along coves and creeks where there are and were hemlock and yellow poplar and other mesophytic species. And that brings me to the second point that kind of leads to thinking about this issue of landscape fire ecology. Much of the landscape burned frequently, but parts of it did not. Fire spread over the landscape in certain ways. And Cecil Frost, in his dissertation research at UNC back in 2000, really invented the concept of landscape fire ecology. And and many different concepts are embedded within this issue of landscape fire ecology, but fundamental to it is the topic of fire compartments. And a fire compartment is an area of the landscape in which a fire, once ignited, can spread through that area without encountering a barrier. So it could burn theoretically the whole compartment. And here's an example that he gave in his dissertation. This is a map from the Piedmont, really around Charlotte, North Carolina, actually. And what you'll notice is that the compartment is bounded by creeks that would block the flow of fire. They would be barriers, but anything within that compartment is fair game for a fire to spread across. So a fire ignited anywhere within that compartment should theoretically be able to spread across the whole compartment. Of course, with prevailing winds and uphill flow of fire, some parts of the compartment would burn more frequently than others. And that's why he's designated the ridgetop as a darker area. Fires flowed uphill, propelled by westerly winds up into the top of the compartment. So different parts of the landscape are exposed to different levels of fire. One thing to note here is that a landscape with large fire compartments would burn more frequently, all else being equal, than one with small fire compartments. Because with large fire compartments, only a few ignitions are needed to burn large areas of the landscape. And so even with a low ignition density, the whole landscape could be turned over through fire on a frequent basis. What we don't really know is all that much about is fire compartment sizes on the Appalachians, or how large the fires grew in the Appalachians in the past. We do have evidence from the fire-scarred trees where we sampled from different pine stands on a mountain. Here's a good example. Those dark-colored slopes are covered with pine, and then you can see they alternate with a lighter colored oak forest. We sampled from multiple pine stands, and when we have a synchronous fire in the same year across all those different stands, we have good evidence that fire was spreading across at least an area of that size, but they might have spread over much larger areas as well. Regardless, the Appalachians have more barriers to fire spread. The fire compartments are not as large as they are in some other areas, like the coastal plain, for example. The witness tree study of Rabun County gives us some insights too. Most of that landscape was covered with pyrophilic trees like oaks and with possibly grassland or some kind of open areas. The pyrophobic trees were actually concentrated just around the streams, as we'd expect to be the case if the streams formed a barrier to the spread of fire and generated some fire sheltered areas in their vicinity. We did a little GIS analysis based on stream buffers. So on the x-axis here is distance from the stream, 0 to 100 meters, 100 to 200 meters or greater than 200 meters from streams. And on the y-axis is the percent of trees within each buffer. The dark part of the bar represents pyrophobic, the gray represents pyrophilic trees, and the white represents the open lands. And what you see is that the pyrophobic trees, like the maples and hemlock, we didn't have hemlock, maples and because hemlock was counted in for the pine. So maples and yellow poplar, for example, were concentrated along the streams in the areas that you would expect to have been fire sheltered. The open areas that might be grasslands were most abundant in the areas that were distant from streams. As you would expect, those would be the most fire exposed sites. The farther from streams they are, the more exposure to fire. So most of the landscape, though, was covered by pyrophilic trees and treeless points, regardless of exactly how large the fire compartments were in Raven County. There was either large enough fire compartments and or a frequent enough ignition density by Native Americans and lightning and then by white settlers later on to maintain a very frequent fire regime. Another thing to notice, that's Bartram's route there again. The treeless points and pyrophilic trees were not only concentrated along Bartram's route. We might think Bartram only observed a lot of open grassy areas, and it makes the whole landscape appear to have been open and grassy because he traveled in the places that were easiest to travel. But even when you look at the witness tree record from the whole landscape, you see that those pyrophilic trees like oaks and the open, possibly grassy areas were over the whole landscape, not just where he traveled. So his report really isn't, there isn't really a concern about him being biased toward open areas. The third point I want to make is about interactions. Fire regimes are embedded in the total landscape, and what we're just looking at is a good example of that. Fires spread over the landscape, the encounter barriers to fire spread, fire compartments, and all that. Those are examples of how the fire regime is part of the landscape. It's not just an abstract thing with fire history, fires occurring at a certain interval. They're actual things embedded in the landscapes. And here's just one more example of that: lightning ignitions. I've mostly focused on human ignitions, but lightning ignitions are important in some parts of the Appalachians, and I think were in the past pretty important. This is this is the western side of the northern Blue Ridge in Virginia, around the James River Face Wilderness area, where a large lightning ignition occurred back in the early 2000s and burned a lot of the thousands of acres of the land there. That Glenwood Peddler Ranger District in Virginia and the Grandfather Ranger District along the eastern escarpment of the Blue Ridge in North Carolina, those are lightning ignition hotspots. And that reflects the terrain atmosphere interactions where synoptic level or regional level winds encounter the upslope flow that occurs in the morning as the sun shines on the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge in the morning, results in convergence of wind of air currents on the eastern side of the mountain, and creates an offset where the clouds build up just downwind of the ridge crest. When we look at this satellite image of the Blue Ridge in central Virginia, this is around the Shenandoah Valley and some of that area where the Kelly Mountain fire scar site was located. You can see those little white puffy things. Those are cumulus clouds building up over the Blue Ridge. This is probably late morning, early afternoon on a summer day. Just downwind of the ridge crest, the clouds are concentrating there. And over the course of the day, convection can build up, thunderstorms can develop, and it's easy to imagine those thunderstorms then drifting over the Piedmont and igniting fires that would help explain the savannas that John Lederer noted there at the base of the Appalachians on the western Piedmont. And then finally, the fourth point here I wanted to make about landscapes is what I'm calling envisioning and restoring historical fire-maintained landscapes of the Blue Ridge and vicinity. We're fortunate to have a landscape painter, Philip Juris, who has specialized in trying to convey what historical landscapes might have looked like based on descriptions of Bartram and witness trees and so forth. And he's graciously allowed me to use some of his paintings here in this talk. I think there's a good case to be made that much of the Blue Ridge and Appalachian and Piedmont landscape might have looked fairly similar to that painting there on the top, with oak being abundant and woodlands, kind of a woodland structure with quite a bit of grassy patches in the understory, glades. In some places, larger grassy openings. In this case, we have his depiction of the Little Tennessee River Valley in Macon County, North Carolina, just north of the Little Tennessee Valley in Raven County, Georgia, with canebrake in the valley. And then in some places, even more extensive prairies. He's got historical evidence to suggest that around Charlotte, the Shuffletown Prairie was pretty extensive there and might have looked sort of like that. And based on those kind of portrayals that we see artistically and based on the data that we have from all kinds of historical and paleoecological records. I know that there are many of you on this who are in the audience today who are using prescribed fire to restore and reconstruct old vegetation, historical patterns, historical structure, historical species composition. On the left there, we have a photo from Steve Croy, who is retired from the U.S. Forest Service. Adam Warwick has all kinds of great photos of prescribed burn areas. And so I just want to commend the work that y'all are doing to restore vegetation and encourage you to keep up that good work and trying to restore vegetation and vegetation structure and wildlife communities that would have been native to the Appalachians, to the Blue Ridge, to the Piedmont back in the past. And with that, I'll close and I'd be happy to address questions.
Well, Charles, thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing your slides. I'm going to bring up Lindsay and I on here, and we will get into the Q&A period for our program today. If you joined us during the presentation, this is wonderful research summary story by Dr. Charles Lafon from Texas A&M, and I'm David Godwin with the University of Florida and Southern Fire Exchange, joined today with Lindsay Hosier from the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. And at this point, we'd like to encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom. It says Q&A, and we'll use that to get through the time that we have to try and get questions answered with Charles. The Q&A tool in Zoom also has a thumbs up option on there. So if you see a question that somebody has also asked and you would like us to try and get to that, please give that a little thumbs up click, and we'll try and prioritize the questions that we have. So with that, let's go ahead and see what's coming in. One of the first questions that came in was asking about historical sources, and the person is asking if you used or had access to any oral histories or other accounts from the Cherokee or other Native Americans that have inhabited the area that you were investigating.
Those, I know that there are some that exist. I don't know how widely they can be shared though. So I think there might be some confidentiality on some of those, but I haven't actually used any of those myself, but they do exist.
All right, Charles, thanks for an awesome presentation. That was really amazing. And the next question that we have is from Chris Cray. He said, a question about treeless survey concerns. How far from the precise location of corner would a tree typically be identified and marked? So if it's considered treeless, how open of an area might it have been?
Wrestle with that one a little bit. We don't, the problem, Georgia, even though it used the regular grid survey, it wasn't the same, and it wasn't of the high quality of the public land survey system that we used actually from Alabama and west and across the central US and everything, in which they would have included distances and so forth. And so as far as I can tell, based on the directions, I've got a book from the library that it's Georgia Surveying Law and History, and the instructions in there are just go out and chop some marks on trees and that are close to corners. And so I think it varied by surveyor. In fact, 4 different surveyors surveyed Raven County, and there are more open area, there are more treeless points in some parts of Raven County than others just along the survey lines. So I think you've hit on something good there. And so I think some surveyors were more reluctant to go a long distance to find a tree than others. And so we just got to take that to mean what it does. I guess if every point in one surveyor, if one surveyor had no trees, then that would mean he was too lazy to go even any distance at all to find a tree. So I think we can make something of it. I think we can't really make anything really quantitative about the structure of the vegetation. But yeah, that is a point, a good point you make.
Another question that came in says, when grouping pyrophytic and mesophytic species, How did you decide to group them? What species did you put into each group? And how did you determine these groups? And asked if
Okay,
a reference to share.
right. We were not the first people to come up with a pyrophilic and pyrophobic classification. Melissa Thomas, Van Gundy, and Greg Nowacki used those designations for the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. They've done some cool stuff over there, over a large area. And they used just species traits that would make them, help them to resist frequent fire. So, there are many species that can withstand fire, regenerate after fire. Over long periods of time. I mean, boreal forest or something like that. But these are species, these are traits that would be adapted to frequent fire. So like thick bark or something like that would be found in the pines and oaks. And so we use the same. Most of the species that we use were overlap with theirs from Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia. And for any species that we had that didn't overlap with theirs, we used the same criteria. I don't have a list in mind, but oaks, hickories, chestnut. The pines and so forth would have been pyrophilic, and then maples and hemlock and birch or something like that would be pyrophobic. And so you could see in the publication, it was published in the Journal of Physical Geography. Anybody wants a copy of that, send me an email and I can get it to you. There's a table in there where we list them all.
We have another question here, Charles. Does any of your fire history research correlate to other research and knowledge concerning the bulbs found in the Southern Appalachians?
Well, I mean, the bulbs are debated, of course, and so I haven't kept up with the research on those, but the latest I read on those was they might have originated with Pleistocene, with high altitude above tree line areas, and then as climate warmed over the Holocene, they were maintained by burning and by grazing by elk and so forth. And so there does seem to have been a fire component to their being there. And so from that perspective, yes, they were probably fire maintained for much of the Holocene, and by grazing, even cattle grazing too, after white settlement.
Andrew says, any idea when a report will be available on the surveys from the Western Smokies outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee?
You mean the charcoal, the soil charcoal? No, I don't know. Sally Horn, I asked her for if she had any information that she wanted to share, and that was what she had. It's a work in progress, so I don't know. Email Sally Horn at University of Tennessee; she'll tell you.
And I had a question. I was curious. You're able to note variations and changes over time in fire frequency. Would you speculate on changes in fire seasonality?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The fire scars do show seasonality. There's a lot of detail that I just couldn't go into here because I was trying to cover different types of proxies about fire, but you can determine or estimate the season in which the fire occurred based on where the fire scar is embedded in the tree rings. And so if they were between two successive full years, and you know that it was during the dormant season, we call that a dormant fire scar, and that would be the fall or the spring. But if they're embedded within the actual ring, so it started to grow and then there was a fire scar, you can estimate how far it was through that ring. Was it an early growing season fire? Was it a late growing season fire? And most of the ones from the Appalachians are in the dormant season, so fall or spring. But some are but there are others in the early wood. And it's hard. What we need to study, and we haven't, is we don't really know when the rings start to grow. I mean, that's the last thing the tree is going to prioritize. And so even if it's in the dormant position, it still could be, I don't know, maybe April or something. I mean, are they actually, so we did core some trees at one of our sites in May one year, and I remember it was one of those late springs, and I remember even in May there wasn't any growth that year. So we don't, we don't know exactly what the seasonality was. But looking for changes in seasonality just based on the position in the rings that we do know about, there's not any kind of pattern there that would suggest any kind of coherent changes in fire seasonality across time that would make sense. I mean, there's nothing coherent among the sites or anything.
I've wondered how, as forest and landscape composition changes over time, chestnut blight, and then just kind of a century plus, maybe even more, towards mesification, your landscape flammability changes. As landscape flammability changes, then your burn windows shift as well. And you kind of, in my mind, it feels like you get kind of pushed to the margins of your burn windows. As the landscape becomes less flammable, then you kind of get hemmed in to the most the times of the year when they're most prone to fire, right? You're kind of your margins. And when we might have had wider windows in the past, that's just
that's a good point. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that the fire scars that we're interested in were formed during the Little Ice Age, which it covered all of the colonial period of Europe of American history up until the mid 19th century. And so most of our fire scars formed during the Little Ice Age. And so leaf out might have been a little bit later then, and the whole phenology was probably different. So we don't know. And then different elevations too. I mean, as we sample trees from different elevations across a mountain, the phenology varies. So it would take some. We have not bothered actually because it would take quite a bit of work to tease this apart. But it's something that we've been long interested in and just have not actually explored fully like it needs to be done.
Lindsay, I see there's a couple more questions. Should we try and get to those and then close things out, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a good plan. Charles, Jonathan asked, what % of opening grassland from elk and bison?
What percentage it's caused by elk and bison? Well, I mean, I would expect that open lands that were maintained by fire were also grazed by elk and bison. I don't think you could tease apart what part of the landscape was maintained by elk and bison. I think it was probably a mix of all those. And I'm, as far as I know, the bison, the presence of bison and when it arrived in the eastern U.S. is debatable. The DeSoto expedition doesn't mention bison, and so it appears that bison moved east after the DeSoto expedition had already occurred. So it's a really historic animal, and so may not have been responsible for maintaining grasslands for much of the time. But elk were clearly present. And so anyway, so I think it was a mix of all those. Like the savannas in Africa, are they a result of fire or a result of browsing and grazing? I think it's kind of a combination of both.
When we get to our last question here is from Adam. Adam says, does research exist that has studied the relationship of drought and lightning ignition? So using tree rings to see how drought with less growth, okay, and lightning ignitions for fire scars. So possibly giving an idea of lightning ignition frequency. Interesting.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Well, one problem with fire scars is we can't determine whether it was lightning or human ignited. And back to the seasonality thing, one reason we did investigate changes in seasonality over time in the fire scars was to see if there were more growing season burns in the past that might indicate lightning ignition, and then more dormant season burns indicating human ignitions later on after European settlement. But we didn't see anything coherent there. And again, we just really can't know. I mean, as we were talking, I mean, some of those dormant season scars could have been lightning ignitions too, in April or even May. I mean, who knows? But looking at modern records of fires, on the fires that occurred today, and just the record that we have of fires that occur in the national forests and national parks and so forth today, I have looked at drought climate fire relationships in that regard, and clearly lightning fires do occur most commonly during drought years, but so do human ignited fires for that matter. And so I think it is an interesting problem that I don't think it's slippery to get a hold of. And so it's like we don't have quite everything we need to whittle it down to these were lightning fires and these were not, and here's how frequently fires occurred that were set by lightning and so forth. I think modeling could be one approach to that. In fact, one of my former master students, Ellen Gass, who I know is on here because I saw her Saw her chime in there a minute ago. For her master's thesis, she used Farsight, that back in 2014 is when this was published, or when it was put together, to simulate burning across the Great Smoky Mountains National Park just at random ignition points at the levels of lightning ignition that we see today. And clearly some parts of the landscape would burn more frequently than others. It didn't look like there was enough lightning ignition density to account for the fire frequency that we actually observe with tree rings or anything. But it's hard to even make a modeling study like that, because it's hard to even parameterize the model just with the lack of knowledge that we have about lightning and how it would have behaved on the landscape in the past and everything. But a very interesting question. I assume that Adam is Adam Warwick, probably.
All right, Charles, well, thank you so much for your time and your presentation today. And thank you everybody who submitted questions. We've pretty much run over a little bit on our time, which is wonderful. Thanks for the opportunity to get through those. Dr. Lafon, do you have any final comments, remarks you'd like to share with us today?
Well, I mean, I think we can just sum it up with, there's lots of evidence of different types. None of it's absolutely conclusive about some of the questions we'd want to know about seasonality and lightning, but we do have evidence for fire being a part of these landscapes for a long period of time, for decades, centuries, millennia, frequently burning on broad expanses of Appalachian landscapes, maintaining pyrophilic tree species and grasslands of various sizes, creating habitat that's great for many different types of wildlife. And I want to commend and encourage those of you who are fire managers who are trying to do your best to restore some of those landscapes. I know that you can't make it like it was over the whole region, but you can do it in some places, and I appreciate the work that y'all are doing.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. If you'd like to follow up with Charles, we have his email address on the screen. I don't know if you can see it, Dr. Lafon, but there's a lot of great comments in the chat thanking you for your presentation today and for your work.
Yeah, thanks for Taylor. There's my student Taylor. Okay, good. Thanks. I appreciate all of y'all tuning in.
So with that, on behalf of everybody on the Southern Fire Exchange team, thank you for joining the webinar today and for spending an hour or so with us.